Okay, hi there. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have a good deal to say before our talk today by Professor ShiPu Wang, but I want to thank you and welcome you to the first in our Edgar P. Richardson lecture series for 2020. I'm Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw. I'm the senior historian and the acting chief curator here at the National Portrait Gallery. And I'm also the director of Portal, which is the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery Scholarly Center and the organizer of today's event. Because we'll be showing images as part of the presentation, we recommend that you select Gallery, Active Speaker, or the thumbnail view in the top right corner of your screen in order to better see our panelists and the presentation. This presentation is, of course, best viewed on a computer or another big screen. However, if you're using a smartphone or another mobile device, we recommend that you orient your device vertically in order to minimize any glitches and to optimize your view. We also have live closed captioning available, which can be accessed along the bottom menu, as can the question and answer function, the Q&A function, into which you're welcome to submit questions to be answered during the second half of tonight's program. Can I have the next slide, please, Jackie? Thanks. In the real world, the National Portrait Gallery is excited to be reopening to the public this Friday, September 18th. Hooray. So if you're in the Washington, D.C. area or plan to be so in coming weeks, we encourage you to visit our website and reserve a free timed entry pass. We will be open Wednesdays through Sundays, 11:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. At the National Portrait Gallery, we believe that portraiture is powerful, but we also fully acknowledge that not all people have had equal access to dominant modes of portraiture, especially painting and sculpture, nor did they always have control over the ways they were represented. And this is especially the case for actively marginalized people of color, Native and Indigenous people, enslaved people, and working class people. Our commitment to diversifying our collections is one that we take very seriously, and we try to collect at least 50% portraits of people of color each year. And we do our best to mount a very diverse exhibition schedule that is real and measurable. This is evident in our permanent collection exhibitions and in our special exhibitions, including Her Story, A Century of Women Writers, which features portraits of 24 influential authors, such as Margaret Wise Brown, Sandra Cisneros, Lorraine Hansberry, who you see here, Toni Morrison, Anne Sexton, Susan Sontag, Maxine Hong Kingston, and Alice Walker. Her Story, which was supported by the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative, opens this Friday along with the museum. The theme, Women, Portraiture, and Power, was chosen in part due to our commitment to diversity and inclusive programming, but also as a complement to our upcoming exhibition, Every Eye is Upon Me, First Ladies of the United States. With the recent nomination of Senator Kamala Harris as the Democratic Party's candidate for the vice presidency, issues of gender representation and influence seem to be well worth discussing in the present moment. Named in honor of Edgar P. Richardson, this lecture series pays tribute to Mr. Richardson's significant contributions to the field of American art. During his career, he distinguished himself as a scholar, as a director of both the Detroit Institute of Arts, and you see him here in that capacity, and the H.F. DuPont Winterthur Museum. As a co-founder of the Archives of American Art, as president and board member of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and as a commissioner of the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery from 1966, when we were first conceived, until 1979. Mr. Richardson invigorated the study of American art through exhibitions and such publications as A Short History of Painting in America, The Story of 450 Years, first published in 1956. And its 1977 revision was actually a far more diverse publication than one might have actually expected. He included discussions of work of white women artists such as Elaine de Kooning. Uh-oh, my computer is talking back to me. Let me get back to the Zoom. There we go, sorry. Such as Elaine de Kooning, Mary Cassatt, and Cecilia Beau, and art world movers like Juliana Force. Above all, Mr. Richardson sought to inspire his readers, arguing the serious critical study of American art is required to enable us to understand ourselves as a people. The Edgar P. Richardson Symposium was established at the National Portrait Gallery with the generous support of Mr. Richardson's longtime friend and fellow former National Portrait Gallery Commissioner, Mr. Robert L. McNeil Jr. And we're grateful to his philanthropic legacy via the Barra Foundation, whose current custodians have allowed us to temporarily convert the symposium into this online lecture series. Over the coming weeks, we have asked our speakers to focus on women as artists and as subjects. The relationships that they have to power, that they found themselves or made for themselves, or were communicated through their representations. We have also invited meditations on art and artists from outside the United States in the belief that the story of American art is informed by more than the temporal border of 1776, nor can its creative journey be amended by that big, beautiful wall that is being built along our southern geographic border. At the end of each slide presentation in the lecture series, we will have a brief conversation between the presenter, myself, and some of the other Richardson lecturers, followed by questions from you, our online audience. These may be submitted through the question and answer, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I would also like to invite you to join us again on Tuesday, September 29th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time for the second Richardson Lecture, Margaret of Austria, Queen of Spain, Power, Femininity, and Portraiture in the Court of Felipe III, which will be given by Dr. Ross Carlin. Please visit our website, npg.si.edu/portal, for a full list of speakers and topics. And now to introduce today's speaker. ShiPu Wang is the Coates Endowed Chair in the Arts and Professor of Art History at the University of California, Merced. A former Terra Foundation Senior Fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. He received the museum's 2008 Patricia and Philip Frost Essay Award for his essay in American art. His second book, The Other American Moderns, Matsura, Ishigaki, Nara, Hayakawa, from Penn State University Press, was published in 2017, and it was awarded the 2018 Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Book Prize. Wang has authored 2 additional books, Becoming American, ? The Art and Identity Crisis of Yasuo Kuniyoshi from University of Hawaii Press, 2011, and Kira Obata, An American Modern, 2018, an exhibition catalog which was published by University of California Press to accompany a retrospective of the same name. The exhibition, which he curated, traveled to 5 museums in the United States and Japan and concluded its tour at the Smithsonian American Art Museum earlier in 2020. ShiPu.
Thank you, Gwendolyn and Jackie and everyone at the National Portrait Gallery. It's great to be here under this strange circumstance, to say the least. So today I'm going to present some of the images that I suspect that a lot of you have never seen. And we are sort of handling the technological situation. Hopefully you can all see and hear me well. I suspect that many of you have never heard of Miki Hayakawa, which offers an excellent opportunity for you as a viewer to see her paintings without being influenced by any prior knowledge of the artist or the subjects in her portrait. So in my talk today, I will start with taking a closer look at a few intimate portraits by Hayakawa before providing a biographical sketch of this trailblazing American artist who lived through a tumultuous period in the 20th century. My first encounter with Hayakawa's one afternoon was breathtaking. Well, the thinner air in Santa Fe, New Mexico probably has something to do with that. But as I approached the painting hanging on a storage rack inside the museum's vault, it felt as if I walked in on someone's private moment, compelling me to hush so as not to disturb the stillness of the scene. Standing in front of the large canvas, I felt drawn into a space of softness made up of warm hues and layered brushstrokes. The meticulous, interweaving brushwork imbues everything with luscious tones and shimmering quietness. From the bowl of fruit, the prone man on a striped pillow absorbed in reading scattered newspapers, to the wood stove in the back corner. The pot of calla lily, blooming and outstretched, punctuates a mellow scene with animated gesticulation. The painting has remained a percolating source of questions since my first viewing in 2014, and I recognize that the image's ambiguity comes from its seeming straightforwardness, with underlying contradictions. For example, Hayakawa's careful variation of values and edges conveys the physicality of the figure, yet the artist's intricate brushwork, along with a generous use of foreshortening that brings everything up to the picture plane, gives the scene an ethereal, lulling quality. It is visually and compositionally open, while appearing to be closed off in its depiction of a private moment. And as warm and inviting as the painting's formal elements are, the man's turned away body refuses a view of either the figure's face or any visible expressions. The image thus appears to be intimate but distant, accessible yet inscrutable. Another source of mystery is the identity of the man. As my arduous rediscovery of more than 60 widely dispersed Hayakawa works revealed, One Afternoon appears to be one of a series of portraits of the same man that the artist painted when she lived in Pacific Grove in California in the mid to late 1930s. Hayakawa depicted the same man absorbed in his own world, such as cutting a plank in Worker, writing or reading in music, or playing ukulele against a patterned backdrop. My only clue to the man's identity was from Mateo Letnich, Hayakawa's friend in the region, who gave the painting to the Monterey Museum of Art and stated that this Edgar, no last name given, was in a relationship with Hayakawa but left her, and that, quote, a kind older man took Hayakawa to Santa Fe for the war years. Recently, I uncovered a bit more about the undated music, the other portrait also with a ukulele. This work had previously existed as a small, low-resolution image on the internet, but thanks to the help of art specialist Kathy Wang at Bonhams, Los Angeles, it was identified in a private collection where it had been for the past 2 decades. With new photography, we can see an overall gray and soft brushwork that adds a sheen of tenderness to the portrait. The background wall and door seem to match those in One Afternoon, and the face is identical to that in Worker. And the ukulele, of course, was also in the Monterey portrait. And to my excitement, I was finally able to see the text on the pamphlet on the table. My Little Grass Shack in Keakalekua, a Hapa Haole or half-foreign song written in 1933, with a version recorded by Ted Fiorito topping the Billboard charts for 14 weeks in 1934. The song's popularity and the wide circulation of its sheet music mean that its inclusion in this portrait does not tell us much about the man's connection with the song or even Hawaii, because this Edgar could simply be learning to play. Or maybe there was some kind of connection and I haven't been able to figure it out. What identifying this song has been able to do, though, is to date the portrait to around, or at least after 1933-34, around the same time when Hayakawa painted One Afternoon, a painting she sent to the opening exhibition of San Francisco Museum of Art in 1935. This recurring Edward does not appear to serve any allegorical function in Hayakawa's imagery, and it is curious to see that the artist chose to show her men in various states of concentration, solitude, and disengagement from the viewer and, by implication, the artist. In effect, Hayakawa created portraits of introspection that show intimate moments and resist easy reading, while also offering suggestions of something beyond what we can see, perhaps even hints of the relationship between the artist and her model, if one chose to consider psychoanalytical possibilities. The consistent inscrutability of the man is unusual, considering that Hayakawa appeared to prefer straightforward views of her sitters in her extant work. With much care and empathy, the artist depicted her models of various genders and ethnicities as openly engaging as possible. These portraits indicate not only Hayakawa's genuine interest in the people in front of her, but also her use of portraiture to connect with members of different communities. Leaving visible her deliberate brushwork and interweaving colors, Hayakawa's portraits have a sense of fluidity, leading a viewer to see and imagine the model's pulsating energy manifesting on the surfaces of the canvas. It is as if Hayakawa were trying to paint the portraits from the inside out through deploying an intricate play of tonality and shapes that reveal, or at least suggest, the inner qualities of her sitters. A good example is the Los Angeles County Museum of Art's portrait that I analyzed in my book. The body of the man is cropped, and his arms are foreshortened. There are also visible cross-hatches of paint that make the torso look incomplete. But there's nothing unfinished about the face. Carefully constructed through amalgamating facets of colors, the face is substantial in volume, musculature, and vitality. The result is a depiction of a man in possession of a luminous quality that seems to emanate from his reflective skin as well as from within. His eyes, glinting with intensity, complete a dignified portrait. The museum was able to date this portrait to 1926 thanks to the companion painting, Artist Studio by Yongji, a fellow San Francisco artist who painted the scene of Hayakawa painting the portrait. As if demonstrating his own skills and their stylistic differences, Ji added a third figure that mediates between Hayakawa's realism and his semi-abstraction. The side-by-side contrast between the figures, separated only by a thin line conveying the canvas's border, offers a visual dialogue between two artists' approaches to the same subject. In lieu of provenance records, Ji's painting serves as a rare visual authentication of Hayakawa's portrait. Even more crucial, the pair of paintings, along with Otis Oldfield's portrait of Yongji 1926, also in LACMA's collections, point to San Francisco Bay Area's multi-ethnic artistic environment in which Hayakawa flourished as an artist. My quest to piece together Hayakawa's life and body of work proved to be a challenging task, however. The biographical information I was able to find was scattered and discrepant, and my research involved combing through exhibition catalogs, art association membership rolls, federal census records, and Japanese American wartime registration and relocation databases. And I must take this opportunity to acknowledge all the archivists and librarians for all their help, especially Marianne Yoshiki Kovnik, the former archivist at the Archives of American Art at the Huntington Library, for sharing with me her years of research. From what I was able to recover emerged a portrait of an artist who was not only determined to make art, but was dedicated to being an active and contributing member of her community, wherever she might be. Existing records suggest that Hayakawa was a daughter of two Japanese immigrants who settled in Alameda, California, and in around 1923 began her art training at the California School of Fine Arts, now San Francisco Art Institute. Winning painting prizes in her first years at the school, Hayakawa exhibited almost annually in regional shows, including holding a major solo exhibition at the Golden Gate Institute in 1929 that drew critical acclaim. The venue is historically significant. In the first decade of the 20th century, there were approximately 140,000 Japanese immigrants in the US, more than 70% of which resided in California. The Golden Gate Institute was established in 1911 to remedy the negative effects of anti-immigrant policies and to ensure that Japanese immigrants' children received proper and well-rounded education in both Japanese and English. By 1929, the Institute had become a vital center for educational, community, and cultural activities that included exhibitions organized by Japanese American artists. While I did not come across any pictures of Hayakawa's solo show in the press, the few sources I found indicate that it was an impressive display of more than 150 major paintings, mostly nudes, with some landscapes and still lifes. Some of these likely appear in the exhibit, but we don't know for sure. Critics unanimously recognize Hayakawa's artistic talent, praising her work's high quality, the artist's tremendous industry, keen observation, supple fingers, and the irrepressible flashes in her brushwork. The Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Gobin Bihari Lal even used genius to describe Hayakawa, as he declared, quote, "The prophets of a new renaissance have said so often that here, if anywhere, the East and the West will meet and pool their talents and begin new creative romances in cultural history." And Hayakawa's artwork represented, quote, "the full blossom of the Occidental art of painting." The praise was both a validation of Hayakawa's artistic merit and an affirmation of San Francisco's cosmopolitan environment in the depth of the so-called Exclusion Era, a period that saw a series of anti-Asian immigration laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Immigration Act of 1924, and also the mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. This was also the period when derogatory and vile imagery circulated to visualize the so-called yellow peril, a specious perception of East Asian immigrants as quote-unquote menace from the Orient that would not only steal other Americans' jobs, but also, quote, infect American society with racial, cultural, and religious impurities, as proponents of immigration suppression proclaimed. One could argue that the portraits produced by artists of Asian descent and their allies served as statements of resistance and repudiation against xenophobes' propaganda of fear and hate. In other words, by presenting and representing faces of real people, Portraiture by Hayakawa and her fellow artists not only illustrated the multi-ethnic and multicultural alliances among artists, but also functioned as critical means for these immigrant artists to contribute to building diverse communities. The arguably private and personal One Afternoon turned out to be Hayakawa's most publicly facing work, one that she was apparently proud of to exhibit many times, including in some landmark shows. For instance, the labels on the painting's back suggest that it was displayed at the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1939-40. But my research also shows that earlier in 1935, the painting, along with From My Window, a meticulously constructed landscape depicting a view of the newly constructed Coit Tower, were selected for the San Francisco Museum of Art's opening exhibition in 1935. Hayakawa was one of the 12 artists of Asian descent in the show and the only Japanese woman among the dozens of participants. As today's lecture focuses on portraiture, please refer to a detailed analysis of From My Window in my book if anyone is interested. In effect, the two works served as the artist's representative or even capstone pieces of her decade-long status as a productive member in the San Francisco Bay Area art scenes. And Hayakawa, in fact, kept One Afternoon with her even as she was forced to leave California in 1942 due to the mass dislocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans following President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 in response to Pearl Harbor. After Hayakawa's death, the painting was given to the museum by her husband at the time, artist Preston McCrossan, suggesting the painting's significance to the artist. One Afternoon's permanent home in Santa Fe led me to discover that Hayakawa also became an active member of the Santa Fe art community. While the circumstances of her move to Mexico remain unconfirmed, Once in Santa Fe, she began participating in local art shows while maintaining her membership with the San Francisco Art Association even during wartime. In fact, as early as in September 1943, she submitted one afternoon to Southwest exhibit in Santa Fe. And one afternoon was once again front and center in her solo show at the New Mexico Museum of Art in 1944. You see here that I've been able to relocate only some of the paintings, so more discoveries await, and all of you could contribute to the rediscovery as well. Among Hayakawa's artist compatriots in Santa Fe were Merced, Sloan, Bacchus, Morang, and Bernice Langley, who recalled that Hayakawa enjoyed the assortment of interesting people living in the Santa Fe art colony, and Hayakawa's love and delight in people came through in her portraits. Hayakawa's good friend, artist William Ford, also fondly remembered Hayakawa as an excellent artist and gracious person who was beloved. Quote, "She was naive yet knowing, a combination of innocence and sophistication," he once said. Here is one of his depictions of Hayakawa at work, by the way. Ford's astute observation is also an apt characterization of Hayakawa's portraiture in general. Her portrait of Ford has a kind of feathery and hazy brushwork, resulting in a soft, luminous likeness of Ford, whose big, translucent eyes suggest curiosity, innocence, and an intriguing interior world. Another portrait of a young woman in a diaphanous dotted blouse shows similar luminosity, whose blue eyes, pinkish complexion, and hazel hair make her look almost like a female sibling of Ford. This was in fact one of many portraits of women that illustrate Hayakawa's sustained interest in painting people of all backgrounds. And it was a nice surprise to see that the artist appeared to be shifting from a tighter construction of painterly forms in her California days to a freer handling of paint in her post-war portraits, as seen in this ostensibly unfinished but signed portrait of a blue-haired woman. Hayakawa seemed to be moving away from the defined edges and deliberate shading in her earlier paintings, and deployed instead quicker, more casual brushstrokes to sketch out the hair and body. The face maintains the artist's signature facets of paint to show the nuanced undertones of skin, now in a more blended manner that hides the interweaving brushwork she formerly used. The result shows a more spontaneous approach to constructing a portrait, with a stronger visual contrast previously unseen in her work. There's at least one other portrait by Hayakawa that has a well-formed face and an intense gaze on top of a roughly sketched body covered in only a few blotches of color. If such a play of varying forms and negative and positive space was indeed what Hayakawa was exploring in the last decade of her life, one wonders to what direction she might have taken her art had she not died from an illness in 1953 at the age of 48. And if her large body of work were not dispersed into private collections over the years, but instead entered more museum collections, I wonder if Hayakawa's art would have been more visible in accounts of 20th century American art. But Hayakawa is hardly the only critically acclaimed American artist of Asian descent whose insightful portraiture illustrates and reminds us of a more nuanced and multicultural history of the United States. Her fellow artists, such as Hisako Hibi and Mine Okubo, who were also participants in the Golden Gate International Exposition. Here you see Okubo working on Diego Rivera's Pan-American Unity mural, for example. Both of them went on to produce numerous works over decades that are diverse in style and subject matter. I'm only showing a couple of portraits here by both artists, but their large body of work merit more scholarly and curatorial attention. As the National Portrait Gallery prepares for its Liu Hong retrospective that opens in May next year, it is useful to look to these diasporic women artists with deep connections to the San Francisco Bay Area as predecessors who blazed the trail. I will conclude with this quote attributed to Hayakawa. Painting is a mirror of one's own self. If I have any unkindness in my heart, I don't dare take a brush and paint. One must approach a canvas feeling, in a way, pure. The original source of this statement is unclear, but it seems to corroborate the sincerity that we can see in Hayakawa's efforts in capturing and revealing her portrait subjects' inner qualities. And that sincerity, in turn, fostered a discernible sense of connection with all the peoples in her life. With that, I want to acknowledge all the collectors and museums who gave me permission to show their Hayakawa works today. Thank you.
Thank you, ShiPu. This was really great. As a Californian myself, I lived in California for most of my life from the 1970s until the early 2000s. And I've always been struck by how invisible California artists can be, you know, on the East Coast where I am now, but throughout the history of American art, or the way that we write the history of American art, that a lot of them have been written out, and particularly the impact of the San Francisco Museum of Art, which was, which is now SF MoMA, and the early San Francisco Art Association exhibitions. You know, as you noted, the rosters of artists who participated were really diverse. So many women, so many people of color, African American artists, artists of Asian descent. And it's, it's an area which is just beginning, I think, in the last 20 years to really be plumbed. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what the resources are for researching these artists from the Bay Area, from, let's say, around 1915 through the 1940s, how they differ, and what are some of the things that, as you were investigating Hayakawa, you also came across that were surprising, and was Hayakawa kind of a surprise that came out of this initial research?
Thank you for asking that question. Again, I want to reiterate how great those archivists and librarians are, because throughout this research, they were the ones who pointed me to a lot of resources that we don't see really cited in published books. And they are the ones who have been paying attention to them, collecting all the resources. So those archives are of really utmost importance. Sometimes people forget that those are the forgotten sources. And throughout those, so for example, in my research, I had to look at course enrollment records in order to establish the timeline, because a lot of the timelines of the artists, someone like Hayakawa, was really unclear. Records of during World War II, for example, and to be able to sort of map out their movement and trajectory and how they study art was very crucial, because then you get a better sense of the body of a work. And throughout that process, of course, I also discovered, there are a lot of names that kept reappearing, right? As, for example, in the annual exhibitions of San Francisco Art Association's exhibitions, you see the same names again and again. And yet there's really nothing about them that's really written extensively. And so I think those resources are there. It's not as if they are lost, but we just have to have more scholars to take the time to work with the archivists and librarians and to really look at those works. At the same time, and this is sort of a long-winded response, at the same time,
okay.
because a lot of works are in private collections, especially the lesser known artists, it also takes a lot of time to locate those private collectors and to be able to bring them out. And once they are out in the open, I think that more people are aware of those works.
Yeah, it really is. It really can be a challenge to track pieces down that are in private collections, and it's wonderful that the staff at Bonhams, helped facilitate your hunt. I have a question from Rebecca Van Diver, who is one of our upcoming presenters. I'm going to read it though. Because, oh, are you on, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank
Okay,
you
go
so
ahead.
much for this fascinating, illuminating investigation into her portrait practice. I was curious if you could say a little bit more about how she disseminated her works and how they, if she was selling them. You did a great job of pointing out the exhibition history, but I was curious where she was selling her works. And then a secondary question relates to sort of the openness of her studio practice in the portraits we have of her at work.
Thank you for the question. I think that's sort of connected.
I think like many of us, Rebecca is juggling childcare and art historical activity at the same time.
Yeah, that's great. This sort of connected with Gwendolyn's question too, is that the reason that a lot of works are in private collections was a lot of these artists were not represented by a commercial gallery. At least this is what I've been able to find, is that they're not represented and they're not circulating in the market aggressively per se, right? And so over the years, some of the private collectors will hold on to their works for decades until there is maybe a reason to sell or someone sort of seeks them out. The disbursement of her work had to do with the fact that when she moved to Santa Fe, it seems like she brought a lot of the works with her. And Santa Fe East Galleries, which closed down in the, I think, late 80s or early 90s, I'm not sure, did a show of her work. And I found out that a lot of the private collectors have works from that exhibit. So that's how you can sort of trace back. And I still don't know exactly that I can establish every single piece's provenance. So there are still works out there that I've seen, but I don't know for sure. And so that's the biggest challenge for, I think, for scholars and curators, to be able to see those works, but also to establish authentication or at least know where they came from. But it sounds like she kept most of the works because she was not really a commercial artist per se. She did mention that writing in a few letters that we actually were able to see that, oh, I only sold 2 paintings in this exhibition. So she was selling, I think, in some occasions, unlike some other artists.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience. Emily Shapiro, we're going to unmute you. It may take a second. Can Emily get through? Well, I'm not sure if that was successful. So I'll go to one of the questions that I have typed in. Emily, if you can, put the question in the Q&A and I'll read it out in just a minute. But one of our attendees who prefers to remain anonymous, because this is a very controversial question that's being asked, what do critics and others say about Hayakawa's use of color?
Well, so there are few critics' writings about her, and so the one I show on the screen was really the most extensive one, and so that was part of my struggle. Is someone who exhibited so much, she was often just mentioned in name, but there was no description or assessment of her work. So I really can't answer that question. But based on that one review we have, I think the irrepressible flashes of brushwork, and that's a glowing review. I don't know much about the colors. Now I can say, and I always hate to bring this up, but obviously I'm bringing it up myself. In the 80s and 90s, there were a few articles written about Hayakawa, I think in conjunction for the occasion of her major exhibition by the Santa Fe East Galleries. And people like to put Cézanne in there. And while you could see that in some of her works, or earlier works especially, I personally resisted doing that because it's as if I have to assess a woman artist of her own merit within the framework of a European male artist.
Mm-hmm.
She never really talked about that, oh, Cézanne is my idol. Well, if that's the case, I think it's reasonable to say how she took his art and elaborate on that. But we really don't have that connection either. So in terms of the colors, I think her colors are quite interesting because if you look up close, they're just so layered and very meticulous, the way every brushstroke, every color is put on the canvas, and quite thoughtful as well.
Mm-hmm. And the style really changes over time. I was really struck by those later portraits and the level of experimentation, with the very, very high level of finish in the face, and then everything else kind of sketched out. And you said that it was signed, right? Indicating yes, it's ready to go out the door. So she had, ended at a very different kind of, or ended, but her career progressed and the style changed over time. I have a question here. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, although we should say that signature, as a lot of people in the audience know, sometimes is problematic because sure, the names could be signed at one point for whatever reason. Because she didn't have a big market, it's unlikely that people forge her signature, but you also never know, because I've come across artists and sort of managers of those estates wanting to put a name to the work and signing those works, which happened too.
Well, in that regard, if the signature can be put there by somebody else, with a number of those, a number of her paintings, I was curious about the titles. Right, mm-hmm. The portrait of the African-American man that was yes, also kind of there he is in the background in the jazz scene, maybe as the bartender, right? It's called Portrait of a Negro, right? And with the portrait that you showed of the young man Edward with the ukulele, you changed the title yes, from guitar / yes, to ukulele. And this idea that the title, right, comes from the artist, again, is not always true. With the titles that have accreted to her paintings, what sense do you have? Because often you just have the titles of the work and you don't have the works. But what sense do you have that the titles that are actually with works are the ones that she intended?
That's a fascinating question and something I actually struggle with. So take Lacma's portrait, for example. On the back, there's actually a label, and it looks like to be her handwriting, and that says Portrait of Negro, right? So it was just a casual title, I think. In general, I've discovered, especially based on the label, she didn't give her titles a lot of additional meaning for you to sort of explore, right? Pretty straightforward in that sense. Later owners would also give titles, which happens to a lot of untitled works. In my research for my book, for example, Noda's painting was renamed multiple times. So there are those situations. I think for her, because she was just submitting them to exhibition, right? So it was just, okay, here's the name for the painting, and here's my name. And so I have to cross-reference that with exhibition records. I know this is what get historians and art historians very excited, because you can cross-reference things, but to most people, that's just very boring. But I have to really check and say, oh, in this year, she named it this way, but is it the same painting as the one that was exhibited 3 years later? So that's really the most challenging part. And so I wouldn't invest so much meaning in the titles per se. And a lot of the circumstances led to the current titles that we have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I have a question here about her education. It's this is from Jenna Wendler. Jenna asks, can you speak more about the education at the Golden Gate Institute? You mentioned that students there were taught both English and Japanese. But were they also being taught about art from these two spheres of influence? And that's an interesting question, given that, some of those comments about like, Occidental art reaching its zenith, with a little push.
Yeah.
So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Okay. If I didn't make it clear, I apologize. The Institute was just a venue for the exhibitions. So the artists used that venue to organize exhibitions. But there, in terms of the education, I don't have the list with me, but there was a long list of everything from etiquette to writing to performing arts to literature. It's a range of different subjects, and in my book I actually listed all those, and also I listed the enrollment numbers. It really grew from 1911 all the way through. So a lot of the parents were sending their kids there because they realized that the school education system at the time couldn't provide their children with a well-rounded education, but they also wanted them to learn all things about Japan. And so within that institute as a school, they provided that. The institute is still there in San Francisco. So I showed that picture that I went and took a picture of the outside.
Wow, over 100 years, huh?
Yeah.
Is it functioning similarly to the way that it did then?
I'm not sure, but on the day I visited, I heard kids. So I assume that the kids are still inside. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Melissa Garcia is curious about other artists besides Cezanne, who we talked a little bit about, that Hayakawa may have drawn influence from.
That we don't
Inspiration.
know. Yeah, that we don't know, but hopefully more people would do research, and those people who are tuning in from Santa Fe will say, well, I know this and I can show you that. That would be great, because during my research I couldn't really find writings by her, because I think for us, our historians, that's one source, not the only source, but one source, the primary source by the artist to talk about quote unquote influence. So that we don't know if she had different sources of inspiration for her art. But I think within her orbit, so to speak, in Santa Fe, you could make your own connection with artists around there. Because, for example, I mentioned John Sloan, and they belong to the same drawing group there. And she would be one of the organizers for the drawing group, and she would cook for the people in there, and as sort of a gathering. And when you're in a group, you can't necessarily say that you're influencing each other, but at the same time, you're also within that milieu. So you could be picking up something over here or there. The pair of Yongji painting and Hayakawa's painting, right? They are painting the same model. It could be at a school or at Yongji's studio, but obviously they were not influencing each other. So the question of influence or source of inspiration is unclear and also often difficult to answer. I'm not dodging your question, but in this case, we need to have more primary sources. And unfortunately, the story is that if she had any papers, they might have been lost. At least that's the story I've heard.
I was going to ask about her archives, whether they exist somewhere. She didn't have any heirs, huh?
No, and the people in the McCrossan family lineage, I don't know what they have. I tried to contact some of them. I was not very successful, but I've seen only letters that she wrote to Ford in 1942, 43, 44, around that time. So those were the letters that I could really hear her voice, so to speak. And those letters were all about what happened in Santa Fe, sort of a little bit gossipy about what happened.
With that pointy chin, that's such a pointy chin that she gives him in that portrait. I kept thinking about, was it really that pointy? Is she exaggerating that? Was that some aspect of his personality that she was focusing on? And this connects with the question that we have from Crawford Mann. about gender and power and the gaze. Crawford says, asks, as a female artist, often portraying male subjects, potentially inverting traditional relationships of power and the gaze, how would you characterize Hayakawa's engagement with gender roles, both in her portraiture and in life?
Oh, okay. That's a great question. Thanks, Alex. If you recall some of the sketches I show, right, those are in private collections. The figurative studies, she painted male nudes as well, and that was obviously part of the training. I get a sense, at least based on the works that we are able to see, she didn't really distinguish between the genders. Although later, the female portraits, they were freer, as I mentioned, but I don't think that was a gender-based approach. She was just exploring, or here is the impression I get, and I'm putting a little bit of my imagination in there, is that she had a person in front of her that she wanted to paint. It's really regardless of the person's gender or ethnicity. And it's to get the essence
do
of
you
that
really
person.
think so? Because that Edward was pretty handsome. I mean,
well, so Edward is a group of its own, because she was obviously,
yeah,
I hate to say,
it seems like there was a relationship there.
Yes, yes, and I have colleagues who have suggested that, you know, you should also look at how perhaps some of them showing a certain kind of frustration in this relationship, right? You can, even if you want to go for that, right?
Why won't he look at me? Why do I always have to paint the back of his head?
Yes,
right?
And she made that choice, though, right? That was a choice. She could have painted him looking at her, or at least the viewer, in her other portraits. So there was something to explore there, but without knowing him, I felt that I couldn't really go deeper into what that might be, and I didn't want to speculate, especially.
So that's very kind of you not to you know, to color it otherwise, and kind of, you know.
Well, relationships are complex, right?
Yeah,
we all know that. Yeah.
But yeah, there was one female nude there, which seemed like an image that was done, you know, in class, right, with the female model with the veil over her face, you know, is there much presence of male or female nudes in the works that you found? Or does she tend to?
In terms of paintings, I've seen more female nudes, right? Well executed, including the one at this New Mexico Museum of Arts collections that I show. That's a huge painting, and I was taken aback when I first saw it, because that was a very confident depiction of a female body, right? From I think that was from 1926, 27, around that time. And so she showed a certain sort of comfort and confidence in approaching those bodies. I have not come across male nudes. So maybe this is the way to answer Alex's question, is that maybe there's a different kind of relationship to her female subject versus male subjects that we need to be able to say for sure if we could find more of the sort of pictorial evidence to establish that difference. And so far, as I mentioned, I've only seen about 60, a little bit over 60 works. So that's not, I mean, that's not enough to really establish any pattern.
And has your work on her changed the visibility so far of her work? Is it now in demand for exhibitions, inclusion in exhibitions? How is it? How is your research changing her presence?
Well, I'm here, so thank you for that. So that's the first thing. I've received different inquiries about paintings that people have in their private collections. I don't see her in exhibitions yet, but I've heard interest from different curators, museums, private collectors. I show some of the images from private collections, including the one with the Chinese man. That was pretty recent. And so hopefully, and the reason I wanted to talk more about her, I've given, I think, 3 lectures about her is hopefully more people can hear about her and see her work and say, oh, I have something by her or in our attic. I did encounter a audience member who told me that her mother had that blue-haired woman in their home for a long time, which was helpful because then I can say, okay, there is a clear source of where it came from, and that's from Hayakawa, right? But we need to have more of that.
And it really is only by, getting the word out there, right, that, one is able to reconstruct these careers, which, it's such a shame how many of these artists from, from the 1920s, 30s who are working in San Francisco have, just really kind of, disappeared. And even the ones like Hayakawa who had these relationships with other prominent artists, when those artists, like you mentioned, in Mexico, artists like Sloan and Morang, Dasberg, Barcos, who are all kind of working together, they've been focused on, the ones who brought a reputation with them to the area, they've been focused on, but the circles have been less explored. How was it when you were at the O'Keeffe doing that research? Did it, were those imbalances evident in the archives there and in what people had been looking at?
Oh, the O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe?
Yes.
They didn't have anything. I visited all the galleries. So there are quite a few gallerists who, some of them own quite a few Hayakawa works. So she was a well-known name, I think. And obviously in Santa Fe, people here and there, or even those who moved away, have her works. But I think the challenge is that when you see her name mentioned in publications, so for example, Patricia Trenton, Phil and Marian Kovnik, their books, and they are all biographies. And when you read those biographies, you say, oh, that's a fascinating person. But there are no images to go with, right? There is not a visual inventory for curators or researchers to be able to map out. And so that creates a problem. And for gallerists and collectors who own those works, they have so many works and others to take care of. It's not, right? Sometimes it's hard to promote just one specific artist. So when someone like me shows up, they share everything, or mostly everything with me, but there's only so much that we can do.
So we're coming right to the end. I want to try, if Emily is still with us, Emily Shapiro, I want to try and unmute Emily and have Emily do the last question. Can we get Emily on the line? I'll count to 5, and if no Emily, I have one other last question. Okay, can we try and unmute? Oh, Emily has left. She got tired of waiting. I have one last question from Sandra Dykstra. Can we unmute Sandra Dykstra? Is Sandra still with us? Okay, well, I have Sandra's question.
Hi, I'm here.
Oh, yay. Okay, go ahead. I'm very excited.
Okay.
Hi, Sandy.
Hello, how are you, ShiPu? I want to say that Bram Dykstra and I, the proud owners of From My Window, which Bram found on what street was that? In Polk, I think, in San Francisco at an antique shop. I was visiting the then publisher Sierra Club, came out and he had this painting. And I said, how did that happen? Anyway, I just, what I wrote just now is going to say is, ShiPu, you were able to dispel the myth, which we had been repeating for years, that Miki Hayakawa had been incarcerated in an internment camp. And what I wanted to find out is, how you were able to ascertain that she really had a more peaceful life in Santa Fe, and married life, and an artistic life, and sadly that life was cut short by cancer. But how did you find out? I mean, you were able to dispel that myth, which is just extraordinary, because we had been repeating it for years, and it seemed like that's what became of her.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Sandy. So in my book, I'm advertising my book. In my book,
That's
I have a more detailed sort of outline of what are the sources, and what I was able to do, and I'm happy to be corrected, by the way, for anyone out there who has information otherwise, is that the camp in Santa Fe was not one of those 10 camps where families would move in. So the Santa Fe camp was more for prisoners. And throughout the life of the prisoners, there were about over 4,000 male prisoners in there. So if it was a prison camp for males only, she wouldn't have been in that. And so when I found that, I started to look for registration records. And what's curious is that, and this is something I call this the history's mystery. I still can't figure out why she stopped being recorded in census records by about 1940, right? So 1930, we saw her with her family, and by 1940, we really don't see her records anywhere. Not, as I mentioned, in the Japanese American wartime relocation databases either. And that's a comprehensive, important registration database for all the people who were sent into camp. So with that, so those two factors really ruled out that she was in the camp. Now there are, and Sandy, you are not the only one, there are still stories of her being in the camp, and local artists formed somehow a rescue mission to get her out. But as you know, stories also need to be verified in that regard. And so far, I haven't been able to find any definitive record. And finally, because I could see that she started exhibiting even during wartime, that means that she was not necessarily in the camp at the time. Of course, there are situations where camp art schools send their works out for exhibitions, but at least in that instance, it seems like she was already in the community as opposed to somehow being in that prison camp.
That's fascinating. Wow. Well, I want to thank you so much for your presentation and for the discussion and taking questions. And this has been a really great start to the Richardson. And I would like to encourage everybody to come back and join us again for the next presentation in a couple of weeks by Dr. Ross Carlin. And subsequent presentations should be equally exciting and stimulating. So thank you and have a good evening.